To my left is Myint, the editor of Mizzima. Some of you may know of Mizzima for many years. It was an underground news service which Myint was running from his base in India for several years before democracy, and now he's back in Yangon where he is again running Mizzima as an independent news agency. Interesting thing about Myint, which I know most people love to hear, how he ended up in India from Burma was by hijacking a plane to draw attention to the plight when the military coup happened, and there was very little attention on Burma because I think at the same time there was the Gulf War going on. So with the bar of soap, he hijacked the plane and ended up in India for many years. 23 years. We have Ameet Dhakal, who needs no introduction to this audience, is the editor-in-chief of Setopati, which since its advent, it recently completed 1 year, 15 months now. And its readership has been growing exponentially. It's become one of the most trusted sources of news in Nepal. To the left of Ameet is Siddharth Varadarajan, again needs little introduction. Siddharth is currently a fellow, but earlier he was with the Hindu, where many of you may know that he was brought in to the Hindu newspaper as part of the paper's efforts to professionalize the running of the organization. But his very efforts to do so brought him in conflict with the owners. And in fact, it was also his efforts to put a curb on the Modi mania in the media, which brought him into direct conflict and led to his unfortunate removal from the paper. Last but not the least, we have Farah Ghuznavi, an author. She has authored Fragments of River Song, a book which you will find outside in our bookstall. Farah is also a very well-known columnist and writes for several media in Dhakal. So I think this is going to be a very exciting interaction, taking off from where some of our earlier speakers, when the questions that they raised. But I would first like to start by inviting our panelists as well as the chairman of our South Asia Trust, Hari Sharma, to release our latest issue of Himal's Quarterly, Growing Media, Shrinking Spaces. Ruby Bhajacharya, marketing manager, will give the copies of the book to the panelists. Hari, would you please join us on the podium for a minute? Sorry to make you walk up and down. I think you can just stand up and unwrap the books and show them, and that will be our release.
Very South Asian ritual.
What, we don't get stars? So our session is titled Media Survival in a Changing Environment, and we hope to discuss several issues related to how the media is growing in South Asia. Perhaps I can start by taking off from a comment made by Kanak in the last round, where the Indian media goes, the rest of the South Asian media will follow. Probably not necessarily the best of things, considering what we have heard about the way Indian media is growing. Maybe I can start with Ameet, if you could speak about whether you think the trends in Nepal are going the same way as in India.
I think so long as corporate media is concerned, Nepal definitely followed the India path, India model. And that model was, media house was owned by a businessman or businesswoman. I think very few businessmen, very few businesswomen, and the price was very subsidized. The readers didn't pay much, maybe about 10% of the total revenue of the business house. And then what happens? The loyalty of the media house lies with the market. And we followed that, and that's the true story with all the major media houses in Nepal as well. I think there are other trends in Nepal which are trying to be counter trends. We'll have to wait for the success stories. Radio, as the former session in first session many panelists talked about, that's one trend. Online journalism, which we are trying to start and see if we can be independent, can earn our living, and can speak on the same length to power, to people, to corporate houses. That's the experiment going on.
So could you tell us about what's happening in Burma? Of course, the space for independent media has opened up only very recently. But who in Burma is investing in media, and why are they doing so?
For Burma, Myanmar, for me, I think we are just at the beginning stage of opening up, including in the media industry. But even with that beginning stage, we see some similarities that I was in India, the way India was opening up. I see some similarities that India had in 1990s. For example, from state control media to a private media, the transition, one part, and then the private corporate houses investing in the country. For the first part, when we say the media in the country, the independent media in Myanmar, we are talking of only print so far. Print is open up for the private media like Mizzima. I have license, I have daily newspaper, weekly papers in Burmese and English. I can write, but I have problem with access to information because it is just at the beginning stage of reforms from the ministries not disclosing their information to trying to share their information to the citizens, including the media. But on the other hand, the broadcast sector is controlled by the government. I have television content that I provide to the state media, state broadcasters, but they censor the content whenever they don't like the things in the radio or in the television programs that I produce. So we are talking of just half full class when we talk of the media in the country. That is when it is linked with the government control. Second thing about the private corporate houses investing in the country. One, the newspapers were given license to the private. That was like in April 2013, a little bit year ago. The first thing who invested in the newspapers are those linked with the government, linked with the establishment, linked with the previous military regime. And of course, there are smaller publications coming up, but unfortunately, these smaller publications are going to die, and they are dying as we speak. It is a question of 1 year, 2 years. Some smaller publications are dying, weeklies, for example. Bigger ones, daily newspapers are being invested by those linked with the establishment, previous establishment. So it is a struggle for me. Okay, we struggled when we were outside the country for free media and independent media, but it was in fact easier many ways. The only question was we were not there. It was difficult. Okay, we could be jailed in the country. Now we cannot be jailed, but it is more difficult to keep our independence, editorial independence, and then to be a journalist. For me, there was one question when someone asked. For me, it's a question also to be an independent journalist in that situation. So I was like 2 years ago, I was like either I stop Mizzima or I'm hired by a big media houses. I didn't do both. I try to continue Mizzima Media with whatever. Of course, finally, I am lucky enough to get 2 partners. And one of them is a big businessman in the country. And of course, he is not linked. He was not linked with the establishment, and he is a businessman. But what I make sure with that limitation is editorial independence is with Mizzima, original Mizzima, me as a founding editor-in-chief. So I make sure I put it in the shareholder agreement. And good thing about my partners is that they don't interfere. But of course, that is the struggle I do in the newsroom every day. The struggle, the interference, the things coming from not from my partners, from the marketing, from the advertisers, from the vested interests, both political and others. So for me, it is just a continuous struggle to keep, first of all, to be a journalist, as I want to be, independent journalist. Secondly, to keep the editorial independence with the mission, vision that Mizzima, when Mizzima was established in 1998 in India. So that is what roughly what we are doing. What we are with. Quite, of course, we need to innovate. We need to be innovative. We need to be creative. So Mizzima now have products. Even though we don't have a license for television and radio, our products are on mobile phones, video, radios, SMS. And then we are going for internet, because internet is, when I set up Mizzima, it was on internet. So internet is growing in the country. Mobile companies are coming in heavily, investing in the country. So we use these spaces, whatever spaces available, and to be expanded, and for the mission, vision that we believe in.
So what percentage of your revenue is now coming from the advertisers?
In XI, Mizzima dependent on the donors, like from the media support groups, and we decided, it was not the donor decision, it was Mizzima decision, that not to depend on the donors when we moved back, because we were very clear to do 2 things. Outside the country as a refugee, okay, we didn't have space, that's why we depended on the donors. Now back in the country, we have small space at least. And we decided to do 2 things. One, to do a media business, and second, to contribute the reforms, media reforms, as we can. So when I say media business, it is a business, and it depends on advertisers, it depends on the subscribers, it depends on sales. So most of all of our income are from the advertisers or subscribers or sales, but we do generate revenues as a content provider as well, when I say television, radio. So it is main strategy, business strategy. Of course, advertiser is a big one. We have more than 50% advertisements revenue out of the total revenues, but a large also, I can say up to 30% are from the content, as a content provider. Because good thing about the transition and opening up is there are many groups, many media houses coming up, and they do not have content. And we have content. For me individually, and that is what we believe in Mizzima, is content is the key, and I can sell the content. So we try our best to get the good content, and we sell it, and we do revenues from the content selling.
Can I say something? See, we often criticize corporate media, but to be fair to the businessmen, to be fair to the businessmen publishers, even if they are well-meaning, and even if they want public service journalism, the revenue structure today we have with the big big corporate media, I really don't think they can take on the market. When 90% of the revenue comes from the market and 10% or less comes from the readers, loyalty will lie with the market. The important point is, are we ready to have a conversation on this with our readers? And I don't see that conversation happening in South Asia. we need to talk to the readers if they really want independence. As one gentleman was talking about the power back to the readers. Can we ask that, or are we too afraid to ask that question because readers would be too dismissive, too cynical about media, about journalists that as the storytellers, that we don't believe in you, you are biased, you are prejudiced, or you would be one of the journalists in the corporate media. See, I'm not trying to be high sounding, but we are trying to have an experiment about this. We want to have a conversation with our readers. And I think in Setopati, we are well suited to do that. It is a startup platform. It doesn't need a lot of money. It's new, so people will see it as not tarnished or not big corporate media, which had in the past compromised with certain interests. So what we are doing is we are saying, you and we, you means reader and we journalists, because Setopati is all owned by journalists. All the money that has been invested so far has come from journalists' pocket. And there is no investor, there is no grantor. So we want to ask this question. We as a journalist and you as a reader can protect that independent space of storytelling and providing information. But are you ready to do that? And we will be asking our readers very soon to say, are you willing to pay, if you read Setopati and if you find worth, are you willing to pay 50 rupees a month? We really don't know. Readers might say, no, we don't trust you, it's not worth. We find so much free content online, why should we pay 50 rupees to Setopati? That is very possible. But then we'll begin to raise content. The whole point I'm trying to say is, it's time we ask that question to readers. And if readers really don't care about it, I don't think it is possible to run independent media. Then media as an independent entity is doomed.
That's a very interesting point. I was going to come to the issue of the free content later, but since you've raised it, Ameet, maybe I can ask Siddharth to weigh in on it. Of course, the Indian media is seen as something which has developed much further than the media in other parts of South Asia, but as we've been discussing, perhaps developed in wrong ways. Has the balance of power shifted substantially from the consumer of the media to the advertiser, to the corporate house, and how is that playing out now in India?
See, the consumer or the reader is integral to the business model, because unless the reader is present in large numbers, the advertiser isn't going to come there. So there is a dialectical relationship between the two. I think in order to answer your question and take the discussion forward, we need to understand, Paranjoy spoke in the last session about how the business model of the Indian media is coming under pressure. And, what are the individual components of this business model? Number one, very, very low selling price. So you're selling a newspaper for 3 rupees. The material cost of that paper alone would be around 15 or 20, without counting salaries, overheads, just the printing cost and paper cost. So that's low cover price, high ad dependent, high ad ratios added it to your. I would say the industry norm in India is anywhere from 90 to 95%. I know in Hindu, for example, where we were better off than the Times of India, advertising was still close to 90% of revenues, and in some cases it will be close to 100 in some papers. So that's the second element of this business model. Third element is that and this is a consequence of the first two, that you spend as little as possible on news gathering and reporting. So in other words, you're trying to leverage all the existing free content or bulk purchase content from wire services and repackage that and present it to the reader without spending any extra money of your own on salaries or value addition. And the final element is again something that Paranjoy alluded to, but which I would call the growth of collateral businesses. So because under conditions of recession, under conditions of competition from internet, television, etc., certain categories of advertising have vanished. Like classified ads were very popular source, highly profitable income stream for newspapers. Matrimonials and motor cars and housing has defected large scale to the internet. So these are no longer available as revenue streams for papers. So papers have to develop. They've developed other business models or other businesses. So even if they make a loss in newspaper business, you'll have a steel mill that you hope to make profit from, or you'll do coal mining or power distribution. In the old days, Times of India actually got rid of all its industries. When I joined the TOI in the mid-90s, they still had the vestiges of Rohtas industries and various Sikh industries in Bihar, which they all got rid of. Now you have the reverse trend. So newspapers are acquiring collateral businesses and using their media properties as a profit enhancing, as a sort of profit multiplier for those businesses. So this is the reality that you have. So how do you break this? So you can see how the business model coming under pressure is directly linked to the quality of journalism that you're serving up. So journalism is getting squeezed because you're not spending money on it. It's getting squeezed because your dodgy bottom line makes you more amenable to pressure from the government or from different corporate or vested interests. And you have your own individual business interests that you promote through your media company. And the only way to break this vicious cycle is, as Ameet was saying, that you have to get the reader to pay. And we had limited success at the Hindu, for example. Hindu is a peculiar paper because it's as with all in Indian newspapers, you make money by being dominant in one or two territories. So the bulk of Times of India's revenues historically came from Bombay, and they used to lose money in Delhi until barely a couple of years ago, because the market leader in Delhi was Hindustan Times, and as market leader they got the bulk of the ad revenue. Times' entire growth was based on subsidies from the cash cow that was Bombay. The Hindu's entire growth was subsidized by the cash cow that was Chennai and Kerala. Telegraph made all its money in Calcutta. So the Delhi edition of the Hindu, which was something that was started very late in the 70s, but eventually grew to a number 3 position, selling about 100,000 copies, much less than Times or HT, which do about 7 lakhs or 8 lakhs each. But we found that the Delhi edition was losing money, and we did an experiment that by increasing the cover price by a couple of bucks, we found that we would no longer lose money on each edition sold. So the circulation department would actually have an incentive to go out and sell copies. So we increased the cover price from 5 to 6, 6 to 8. And we found, okay, initially some readers grumbling, but at the end of the day, when we had this conversation, we were telling them, look, we're the only paper giving you quality content, independent, so you have to pay for it. And, some people would have given up their subscription, but others joined us, so we never lost numbers. And I think in its own small way, the Hindu was able to demonstrate that in a market like that, it is possible to get readers to pay. But I remain pessimistic overall, because as internet penetration increases and the reading habits migrate, I think it's next to impossible to expect readers to adequately pay for online content. We all nurture dreams of having paywalls and so on, but and this is just a thesis I'm throwing out for discussion, that I think the reader as a reader will never be convinced enough to pay adequately for what she or he is reading online. But the reader as citizen, the reader as the member of some civic association, the reader as member of some collective in society, can be appealed to. Everybody here, I'm sure, downloads movies and books for free from the internet. So if in this room we're not prepared to pay for content, the average reader out there is not going to pay for news. I think we're living in, especially like in America, the New York Times print subscriber pays $3 a day for the print edition. Maybe it's more now. The last time I was there, it was $3. So to get her to migrate to paying something online is quite easy, right? Because you're paying $3 every day for the print. So getting them to pay $1 online, not that difficult. But the Indian readers used to pay next to nothing for his print, right? So if there's no paywall for print, how do you have a paywall for online? So I think in South Asia this is this is a serious challenge, and the reader has to ultimately the reader or this reader as citizen, because ad yields, and this is now well known, that the old business model, which is at low selling price, high ad revenues, it works well for print. Even now it works, even though it's coming under strain. But online it doesn't work because the yields, they're too diffused. The advertising market is too diffused, and the yields are too low. So eventually, for the kind of venture that Ameet is talking about, or the kind of venture that me and some friends are trying to create in Delhi, create in India now, we are not optimistic about fitting into the traditional business model. We're looking to appeal to people to say, okay, fine, you want to set up a trust, what Kanak was saying, the EPW model, but on a larger scale for news. That you as a somebody who's philanthropically minded, recognize the value for having independent, professionally run journalism, particularly in India of today. And if you do, then you should be willing to support it. It's possible that at the end of the day, you could at least make it break even. But getting the reader to pay is a very tough, to pay adequately. You can get him or her to pay the marginal cost of the delivery, but to pay salary, overhead, tough call.
Siddharth, if I can interrupt you here to bring in Farah. Farah, you are extremely active on the social media and you use it a lot to get information as well, links to free content, articles online. Obviously, the social media has a valuable role, but is it also undercutting the ability for us to get access to well-reported stories which need the owners to invest in reporting, complex stories which take time? How do you view the role of the social media vis-a-vis traditional media, and how do you also assess the status of media in Bangladesh today?
I mean, this discussion has already thrown up so many interesting points that I don't know where I want to begin with this. But in terms of social media, I think it's true to say that there is free content online that is actually quite high quality. So I think this issue of trying to get people to pay for content online will be very difficult, not just particularly in South Asia, but not just in South Asia. By contrast, some of the conversations I've had with print editors of some of the dailies in Bangladesh indicate that despite everything, they're still quite optimistic in the sense that there's a strong feeling. Two of the things that actually came out of Siddharth's points. One is the idea of creating content that is in a way unique. I mean, of course, nothing is unique, but if you invest enough in terms of the content you're producing, you can have a sort of brand in terms of what you're providing the reader with. They know what they're getting, they trust the source of information, and so on. So one issue there is getting a certain critical mass of readers. And the second issue that, and at least one of the leading English dailies editors that I spoke to was extremely, he was very blunt. He said, well, we started relatively recently, we're producing high quality content. This is Dhaka Tribune. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, if I'm producing, content of that quality, I will be able to find a readership in the market. If my material is not of sufficient quality, I can't expect that. The second point that he came up with was something that people have touched on the panel already in terms of advertisement, but his take was slightly different in the sense that he said earlier, we used to go to the government to try and find some advertisements and so on. Now, if you're a successful print newspaper, you can actually have enough advertisers coming to you that you can pick and choose. So this point about corporate influence, I think it's a valid one because we're seeing a sort of increasing corporatization in the media, I think not just all over the region, but all over the world. But his feeling was that if you are selective about who you choose to take your ads from, which requires you to be in a position of relative privilege to pick and choose in that sense, of course, But that should allow you to take care of independence to the point that at least your readers trust that what you're providing them is content that is independent of, let's say, corporate interests or vested interests and so on. In terms of the wider picture in Bangladesh, what we're seeing is, you started with India, and I think that point about sort of corporate influences coming in is very much there, particularly in the television media. What we've seen in the 90s, after the fall of our then military dictator, there was an enormous flowering of print media, and quite a lot of those papers have survived. I think we now have something like 400 plus newspapers in Bangladesh, out of bearing witness to the Bengalis' desire to read and argue over almost anything. But we have, out of that, I would say about 7 of the papers, the Bangla vernacular papers, are sort of relied on in terms of the content and have very diverse content, very specific brand. 3 of the English papers. Now, for the news, for the television news, it was from 2000 and the decade after that we saw a huge expansion. So now we have something like, from an earlier period where we literally just had the government, Bangladesh Television, BTV is called. We now have something like 24 television channels, by and large, which are operating. Every now and then one will get shut down because it's offended the government beyond all acceptable levels. That acceptable level also fluctuates, by the way. But there you see much more the corporatization, I think, because those houses have actually been established very often. I think currently we have 3 government-owned channels. We have something like 12 or 13 very distinct corporate houses funded these channels, and another 4 or 5 which are probably directly owned by politicians. So I would say a worrying tendency for us, in fact, is actually the increasing sort of politicization of the news. And again, in contrast to India, where at the moment there is this sort of Modi mania, I think you called it, we don't have a single personality that is being, is a cult leader in that sense, but we do have a very severe polarization between the 2 main political parties. And what's a bit worrying about the television news is that you can almost pick whose channel it is. Even if it's not owned by a politician from that party, there's a very clear slant. The final thing that I think is interesting, though, and this is where I hope, Ameet, it will give you some hope as well, is that one of the things, there's a general consensus that the Daily Star, which is one of the newspapers I'm affiliated with, and a few of the leading newspapers in Bangla, Prothom Alo is one of them, Daily Star, and so on, they are generally considered, if not neutral, then at least equally critical of all the politicians. So therefore, I think people generally feel that they will get some degree of balanced reportage from them. The downside is, of course, it means that we are very unpopular with everyone in terms of the political establishment. But what's interesting to me is that, and this has been picked up also in some of the research, that again and again it's shown that consumers choose to go to these newspaper outlets unless you have a very specific affiliation and you support the Jamaat, so you take their paper, Inkilab, or whatever. For people who are looking for objective news, they keep coming back to these 3 or 4 key titles out there, and they're doing very well. So while there is the political establishment and possibly the corporate establishment has very specific agendas about the kind of news that they want to put out there and the kind of news that they want, reflecting their own interests, consumers are showing that they are not actually wanting to buy that news. The news that they are willing to pay for is actually the news that is considered relatively objective and detailed analytical reporting. So I think for the print media, there's still quite a lot of hope. For social media, I think electronic media, it's still anyone's game in a way. You can see that there's everything from propaganda websites for particular political parties, which are quite, or extremist parties which are fairly outrageous, to the more sort of the more objective mainstream news. The various newspapers now have their own portals and websites where you can get updated information, and which are, as far as I know, you're not paying for. So your point about the paywall was perfectly valid there. To also these independent kind of commentators, whether they are bloggers or whether they are collectives and so on. There's one website called Nagorik Kontho, which translates as Citizen's Voice, which is basically for citizens to go and register their own, the issues that they are concerned about, and so forth. So I think in social media we're still seeing what's going to happen. I don't hold great hope for payment there, and I don't know what will happen in terms of the advertising, but at least for now the print newspapers are having their own websites, and I guess we'll see what happens when things develop further.
If I can tag on another question to you, Farah, we've seen, especially in the Indian media, what we call a dumbing down of the media, the page 3, half-clad girls, the party pictures, and infotainment as is known. Is that something that you see emerging in Bangladesh?
I think there is a slight tendency that's emerged there, yes, because I see that many of the print newspapers have started to have these sort of 4-page, what they call supplements, which are essentially, to be frank, junk news. It's about what the latest accessory is that you must have, or and of course there's a place for that, but I'm not sure that it's in the newspaper in that sense. So they have these little fluff supplements which come out 2 or 3 times a week with all of them, and that might fit the bill in terms of infotainment. But the general sense is, I think, that people are still very interested in serious news stories, because for 2 reasons, I think. One is that there is a general mistrust of politicians. So it's felt that if you have a media outlet that you can trust, then you will get the real story from them, whether it's on corruption or whether it's on environmental degradation and so on, which are all very hot button issues for us. And also the sort of day-to-day events that really impact people's lives in terms of, we've had a very violent political scenario for the last few years. And I think people feel that they want to know what's going on. So for that analysis, they do come to the media, whether it's the talk shows, which are of varying levels of professionalism, or whether it's the newspapers. And along with that, you have the sort of, I think perhaps they're anticipating what you're talking about in terms of infotainment. But I would say that in general, the kind of dumbing down of serious news stories has not really taken place yet. What you have is almost an alternative stream of, if you want to read soap star gossip, then you buy that particular weekly, and so on.
Siddharth, we of course both worked and at one point at the same time for Times of India, which was the master per all in terms of dumbing down the content. And I remember no story, however complex, could be more than 300 words. Then they decided that the readers don't really want to read 300 word stories, so we have to highlight parts of the story in blue. Then they decided that was too difficult, so we were told we had to summarize our stories in 20 words, I think it was. And when we protested, they said, should we summarize it for you, or would you summarize the own stories that you've written? And we said, we'll summarize it. But where do you see that trend going?
Times is a very complex being, because the Times of India actually has evolved from that. Those are extreme days, actually. If you look at the paper today, it's actually a much better paper than when you and I worked for it. Typically, if there's a good story, they give it space. They are not sort of unwilling. I mean, they're quite willing sometimes to give a rather arcane issue full-page treatment. So as a paper, I would say that it's actually dialed back on some of the worst things it was doing. But the record of what it did then continues to linger. So the paper's credibility is not very high. So stories appear, readers don't necessarily take it very seriously. Its impact, so a story that appears, say, in a paper like The Express may have far greater political impact, because the reader and the political class as a whole will say, okay, this is not connected to some corporate agenda, blackmailing agenda. Not that Times is doing it necessarily, but that's the impression. And I think that
Times is still making much more money than Express.
Express makes no money, and this is one of the. I mean, all of us who like to believe content is king, we shake our heads and wonder why Indian Express, for all these years, has floundered in terms of circulation. Obviously, there's more to simply good content. You have to have good marketing. I mean, there's lots of ingredients that go into the success of a paper. But I think that one of the reasons I have hope for the future of journalism, despite the rather bleak picture that has emerged from the morning session, I mean the post-lunch session and this one, and the general tenor of these discussions, is that the internet and social media has solved at least one problem for a journalist, which is that the problem of dissemination and last mile connectivity is no longer there. That problem is solved. If you have a good story, it doesn't matter which platform it's appeared in. A story may appear in a Times of India that sells 2 million copies, or the Express which sells 200,000 copies, or Business Standard which sells 60,000 copies. If the story is a really good one, and if it strikes a chord with readers, it will find its way through the thicket of information overload that is the internet. And so it's not as if the Times of India, which is the largest media corporation, necessarily, of course, it has the greatest number of Facebook follows among Indian papers. So it's also an internet giant. So it has an advantage. But information cannot be suppressed. Paranjoy's book on the gas wars, most newspapers have blanked out any discussion of its contents, but it's available on social media. Everybody knows that this book is out there. It has content. It has material that the Ambanis don't like, and somebody who's inclined to dig more will know where to go to find that information. So I think that whatever the constraints that we all have, so in a way, the kind of we need to gravitate towards a business model. And since this session is supposed to be about media survival in a changing environment, and I'm interpreting media survival to mean the survival of journalism survival, rather than the survival of Times of India or India Today or any of these established houses. So the journalism survives if it can craft a business model where where public-spirited individuals are able to pick up the overhead for investigations and all the other things that go into news gathering, and to a large extent, or at least patient capital provides the seed money, and then you rely on the quality of your content to essentially win readers for yourself and get readers to pay, as I said, not as readers but as concerned citizens. So even if 10% of them pay, then you can manage without being overly dependent on advertising, which in any case, as I said, in the internet world you won't be. I mean, advertising is too diffused. So I think that's really the direction we go in. And so social media then allows journalism of this kind to get diffused in a way that was not possible if you had a photostat machine 30 years ago, or you had a small paper. There was simply no way you could get it out. I mean, today the internet allows Ameet and I, if we want, to set up our own TV to compete with TV, right? So we can do a discussion, put it up in a 10-minute YouTube video, and find a way to push it out on social media. And compared to the kind of stuff, I don't know what Nepal news television is like, but Indian news television has become so dreadful now. From 7 to 10, you don't get news anymore. You just get, and you don't even have civilized, you have discussions with minimum of 8 talking heads. So it's just cacophonous. And I hope Nepal channels don't imitate that dreadful model. In Pakistan also it's gone that way. So if Setopati or a website in India were to come up with a way to have 10-minute, 15-minute news sort of civilized discussions, and find a way to disseminate it, or to even stream it real time. A year from now, 2 years from now in India, when handheld phones are $3,000, and even in Bastar they would have smartphones, and there would be the 3G or 4G connectivity. Then television also will, internet, a small startup can poach TV audiences.
Ameet, if I can ask you to respond to this, and also there is a certain democratization of platforms that social media and internet has brought. But are there also severe limitations to this? If you break a story on Setopati, does the government respond in the same way as it may have for a major newspaper? Or is it much easier to ignore the smaller media, especially those which are relying on the internet?
Okay, I'll come to that question as well. See, in print media, you really, as an editor or reporter or one who has written the story, you really don't know whether your readers are reading the story. Because the limited information you have about who is reading is just few phone calls or SMS or colleagues, journalists talking, oh, you wrote a good piece. In internet, it allows you to monitor which piece readers are reading. And I'll tell you, readers are very smart. When we wanted to start Setopati, Kunda Dixit suggested us, see, web is a different form, don't write more than 300 words. At least he didn't tell us, summarize in 30 words. But Setopati was anyway an experiment, and we wanted to experiment with long form. And luckily, our most read pieces have been long form pieces. The most read piece in Setopati so far by 340,000 people, I think that is very good given Nepal's context, was 1800 words. Almost all the stories which have been read by more than 100,000 people have been at least 1,000 words or more. So readers are smart. See, what happens in the print is your marketing guys will come and drive their agenda. They would say this story doesn't sell, that story doesn't sell, and they will come with their agenda. So it's really difficult. In web form, in digital media, you know what people want to read. On the question of sustainability of digital media, see, the key thing, as I think, is you have to keep your operations small, and you can do that in digital platform. You don't have to cover everything under the sun. Like in Setopati, we don't have to cover what each and every leader's speech, you know, and we don't have like number of pages you have to fill at the end of the day. That's most dreadful for an editor. I have been through it. You have 16 pages, 20 pages, and you have to fill it. You have good stories, bad stories, crap, you have to do it. In digital, you have a choice. You can write 5 good stories. You don't have to go for 6 or 7 because there are no pages to fill in. So you can really put your operations small, have people who want to tell stories, journalists with integrity, with passion, maybe 10 or 15. I think that's enough to write on issues that matters to you, to write on issues that matters to society. So operations is the key. Number 2, Siddharth was talking about if you can get 10% of your readers. Today, if we can get 1% of Setopati's readers to pay 50 rupees a month, we will be almost more or less break even. So if we can't convince 1 out of 100 readers to pay 50 rupees, I think there is some problem with the journalism we are doing. It will take time. It will take time. It won't happen overnight. See, I was in the US, and that's the third point. You were there, Aunohita, and we were there together. We were in a conference in Austin where digital internet media, like from 40 countries were there. And there were success stories as well. And in almost all the success stories, readers were paying. Readers were paying about 25% of the money. That's good. Look at the print, they are paying like 5%, 10%. And if that increases, and if we can increase that, that will increase our sustainability. Third point, I think advertisement will eventually come. Advertisers will eventually flock where readers are. See, Setopati last month has close to 3 million visitors. It's not big, but compared to newspapers in Nepal, I think none of the newspapers compete with that. It will take time. It's a cultural issue as well. It's not just about economic decision making. It will take time. But as Siddharth was saying, in India, you see some of the automobile advertisements, some of the fast moving consumer goods advertisement, matrimonials, classifieds are beginning to move. So that will happen eventually. So overall, I remain very optimistic. I hope we can have this conversation 5 years down the line, so I can tell my experience of how it went, whether it's been fantastic, whether it's been awful. But if Siddharth and his friends are trying to start, I think you should remain hopeful. You should start it. You'll find the readers who will pay.
So can I just ask Ameet a question?
Sure.
If you have 3 million visitors, what's the figure for for Kathmandu Post website or Himalayan Times website?
I really don't know, but see, I think eKantipur is ahead of us. There are many onlines which are ahead of us, many. But see, 3 million is visitors. In terms of unique IPs per month, is almost close to 600,000. And there are many other onlines who have more than that. But the point is, we are not having that conversation with the readers. You have to pay it, and let's have that conversation. You had that question. See, it depends. Any good story written in any platform will be taken seriously. That's one. Two, obviously, in real world, government would pay more attention to big business houses, big media houses. It depends upon who is writing the story. It depends upon the credibility of the writer. But if you are writing a story, there are good evidence, there are good arguments, and if you are writing consistently, my experience so far is eventually government or policymakers or the concerned people will listen to it.
So if I can bring you in at this point to talk a little bit about foreign investment in media. Given the constraints of resources, I'm sure there must be Burmese media which are looking for that kind of investment, or external forces which are looking to invest in the Burmese media. What are the laws regulating that? Is it a issue of concern for Burma?
No, under the foreign investment law, the foreign money cannot put in the print in Burmese language and ethnic media languages. So that limits the local vernacular media. But on the other hand, the foreign money is allowed for the broadcast sector, which is not open yet. But under the law, it is allowed under the joint venture. So when we say private media in the country now, we are talking of local money being put in the print media. But we also have to note that the government papers are there still. The government has 3 papers, 2 in Burmese and 1 in English, which have monopoly in the market for many years. And of course, they do not have content, independent content, and government have editorial control over that. So people do not like it, but they are ahead of many of others in the market because they were there for many years, and that they had the support of the government in terms of distribution and advertisements network. But I think gradually, even we are seeing the decreasing readership and decreasing influence of the government papers. So even though there is a limitation in the print media, limiting the foreign investment coming in, the private print media is growing. Of course, we are at the beginning stage, as I mentioned. I just want to also go back to the business model. For me, media, we decide to do the media business, it is a media business. So when we say business, it has to be profitable. So how we will make profit? So it depends on the strategies, and also what I'm trying to do, that is our strategy now, is we invest in the converged newsrooms where all our products go out from the converged newsrooms. Of course, print is a big one because it's a newspaper, daily newspaper, but all the products are linked and going out from the one converged newsroom. And now I don't need to invest in the digital media. I don't need to invest in the other products unless I have a television, radio. That I think already I have the base. So I think that is the strategy. And also, of course, what the key point in the converged strategy that we do is crafting, how we craft our media products. Of course, in the previous session, someone mentioned about niche market. But the issue is, it is also not only niche market, it is also what the readers want, what the readerships and audience want. So we have to craft that one. So it is a little bit going into the nitty-gritty there. And secondly, what I like to point out is, For me, in long term, the media, Mizzima now have like print, online, and all this. Our strategy long term is running I call it a cheap airline model. We have to be cost effective, but we have to provide the quality. So we have seen many successful cheap airline models in this. So that's how we have to run. And I'm sure the budget and in terms of expenses and cost are big issues when we are to make money out of this. So the long term, it is like how we run a airline, but it is a cheap airline model, like Air Asia. I think Air Asia is doing really a good example. Of course, again, it is linked with the content. But if you keep your content as much as you can, like when we say page number 3, of course, number 3 is the one which always the advertisers like it, and they want to put it on the number 3. But I do have my editorial on the number 2, page 2, and plus content, news content. More than half of our pages are local news, Mandalay, Yangon, Nebido, and the other ethnic areas. So I think that is the struggle. That is how we craft our content and our business model. That is how we have to do. Be in the industry. Smaller ones are, unfortunately, what is happening is, yes, small ones, it provides niche, but in the Burmese case and Myanmar case, smaller ones are dying and going to die, unfortunately.
If I can ask you, Siddharth, about this interesting issue So has raised about the convergence in the newsroom and cross-media ownership, which of course has been debated times in India as well. Is that the way for economic survival, or are we scared that people like Myint are going to turn into media mughals who are preventing proliferation of multiple media?
You see, there's two ways to think about convergence and cross-media. One is to look at it as a technological reality, that the way in which digital technologies are evolving suggests that the boundaries between print, online journalism, television, and radio are getting erased, and this is a reality, the fact of life. The other way in which to think of the cross-media issue is where you have entrenched players, market leaders in print, developing a market-leading position in other media forms like television and radio. So I think that where convergence and cross-media sort of platforms and cross-media holdings promote the monopolization of the media, I think this is something that should be opposed. And I think most countries have a regulatory structure to deal with this. I'm not sure in Nepal what the discussion is. In India, there's been some discussion on this. There was a working paper produced by the Administrative Staff College in Hyderabad a couple of years ago. Now TRAI, the telecom regulator, I'm not sure under what mandate, but the TRAI has flagged this as an issue for discussion, the whole question of cross-media. But I think that it's important not to lose sight of these two aspects, and that it should not be the case that under the guise of regulating the monopoly aspect of convergence, we end up stifling the little guy and his or her ability to use these different platforms to tell or to provide readers with a novel and unique form of storytelling. Because let's not forget that right now, most of us, when we look at the internet, we're treating it as a static representation of newspaper. I mean, in a sense, it's just an electronic page that we think of, right? We're not layering the story when we mount a print story online. It's just the text that is shoved up there with a photograph, maybe. We don't exploit the different narrative form structure that internet allows us. Some of you may have seen Snow. What's that famous New York Times story? Snowfall. You see where you open the story and then you get video, audio, data, text in a seamless manner. And so people are beginning to experiment with some of this stuff, and I think that's really the promising direction in which journalism is likely to go. Plus, increasing use of and innovative use of data. So I think the modern newsroom will have people proficient in all of these platforms and also be adept and skilled at using data in innovative ways. And right now, hardly anybody is doing this properly.
There are so many issues to discuss, but I would like to give the audience a chance as well to ask questions of the panelists. So I'm going to end this part with one question. I've heard a lot of you talk about how people are going to pay for quality, and that's very, well, it's a ray of hope for all of us. But I have a question. Why is the reporting on South Asia, within South Asia, so very poor? There isn't enough reporting on each other's countries within South Asia, as far as I can see. Farah, maybe you could respond to this, because I know you may have to leave a few minutes early, so if you would take this question first.
Honestly, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, the why. I think I'm inclined to agree with you that most of the media don't appear very interested in what's happening within the region. But I'm sorry to say, I wonder if that's also sort of a reflection of the fact that SAARC seems to be the only body that can't agree on a time and place to meet on a regular basis. So there is a real problem in our attitudes to each other, and for the smaller countries, I think it's partly a question of we have too many problems on our own plate that we're worried about. So what Nepal's problems are, or what Sri Lanka's problems are, Bangladesh is not focusing on. India, imposes itself on everyone because it's impossible to ignore for various reasons. I think it does come up sadly, in terms of regional problems. If you're hearing about the Rohingya situation in Burma, Bangladesh is very directly affected by that, and so that was one of the regional stories that really was a huge part, was very well or extensively reported in that sense. There was, it seems to me that it's generally this is going to sound very naive, but it's generally the negative stories that we hear about each other. So for example, in Sri Lanka, when there have been these attacks on minorities, we hear about that. I'm sure in Bangladesh, when there are attacks on minorities, a couple of the other countries in the region will hear about that. So I'm not really sure what the answer is, but I think one of the reasons for the why is that I don't believe that we have a sense of a cohesive South Asian identity, which is why I think that events like this and publications like Himal are really, really important. The issues of common concern, or even the cultural similarities and the challenges many of these countries face, it's not the same for all of us all of the time, but there are certainly sort of cross-cultural and areas of areas which are relevant. And I think a lot of the governance challenges, a lot of the challenges in terms of communal issues, these are common to many of the countries. So I think we could actually benefit from sitting down and having more conversations. And I don't mean literally like this, but also in terms of coverage in our news media. There should be a lot more than there is, even if there were to be sort of not a quota, but some allocation for having regional stories. I think that would be a start.
I don't think you were being naive at all to say that when there are problems, we report on each other. I think having grown up on a surface of Indian media, I would say India reports about all its neighbors as a border problem rather than anything else. And Siddharth, maybe you would like to respond to that.
And see, the fact is that we shouldn't wish for things that are not practically possible right now. In the sense that, if you ask yourself, what's the level of engagement between the neighbors of South Asia? It's very low. The level of trade is abysmal. People-to-people contact is at a high level between India and Nepal. Also Bangladesh, India, but that has a different resonance. You have large number of Indian migrants who are in Dhakal, by the way, who nobody talks about, and who remit a lot of money back to India, not as much as Bangladeshis remit. But the point is that these are still drops in the ocean. My sense is that one can only do so much to artificially push this process. I know the Hindu, for us it was a matter of honor to have correspondence in all the South Asian countries. Maldives, whenever something happened, the Colombo person would go to Maldives. But otherwise in Dhaka and Bangladesh, in Dhaka and Kathmandu, Pakistan, we were also exploring having somebody in Myanmar when the rules changed. But then I left my job, and then foreign news has generally become less important than the Hindu. But I think we should not be unrealistic. No West Bengal paper. This is something that when I first learned this, I found it a bit surprising. Despite language similarity with Bangladesh, no West Bengal paper devotes any space to internal developments in Bangladesh, except when it concerns minorities or something that has border issues or has some kind of so-called India angle. So this is. But I think the day that the border becomes more open, and you have a lot more traffic between Bangladesh and West Bengal, that thing will change. I think that will change. So I think 10 years, 10, 15 years down the road, you may well find more hospitable territory in the media.
Ameet, can we afford the luxury of waiting for 10, 15 years before we start reporting on each other? I think even for a country like Nepal to develop its water resources, we need a more informed Indian public about these issues. So are we going to wait until the trade, the open borders happen before the media follows, or should the media be leading the process?
I think that's partly true your question, but there's the other way around as well. The question is how much Indian public is willing to know about water resources issues of Nepal, and how much that is going to shape the discourse. It has to, at the end of the day, reflect the level of engagement on issues. See, in SAARC, in South Asia, Bollywood is one of the most cultural engagement of this region. Like anyone watches Bollywood movies, and you look at stories about Shah Rukh Khan or any other actor, that's read widely. But that said, there are occasions people are interested about the issues that are related to other countries. For example, we sent Yuvraj Dai, he is sitting at the back, to India to cover Indian politics in the run-up to Indian elections. And on the election day, the result day, we were constantly updating news about Indian elections. One of the readers wrote to us saying, is this a website in India or Nepal? But we're looking at the meters. That was the day we had one of the highest visitors, because people were interested in the outcome of Indian elections. So, to your question, my answer is yes and no. It depends upon the issue. It depends upon how people are interested, how much we can shape the discourse. But Nepal and India are unique in the sense there are so many issues that affect each other. And I see that reporting in both India and Nepal. For example, hydropower. Hydropower is widely reported in Nepal from the perspective of what the Indian interest is, from whatever we understand that is. And that is reported in Indian media as well. So it's, I think, issue-based thing.
So I'll let you have the last word. As a reader as well as an editor, do you think South Asians are treating each other well in the media?
No. When I was in India, I used to joke, India has only two neighbors, Pakistan and China. And I have 4 pages foreign news. One is on Asia, and generally I don't have stories from Southeast Asia, South Asia. Of course, when Aung San Suu Kyi came to Nepal, I got one story from here. When Sushma Swaraj, foreign minister, was in Naypyidaw, I got story there, one story. So I think it is a lot to do with connectivity, that in terms of peoples to people, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of roads, and I came here via KL, Southeast Asia, and it takes 45 minutes, 1 hour between Yangon and Hanoi, or Yangon and Chiang Mai. And when the country opened up, when I arrived there, I thought Indians will be there. Indians are going to come. I saw Japanese and Vietnamese and Singaporeans, not from South Asia. So I think a lot to do with connectivity is and that we need to focus on. Whether media should lead it or media will follow it, I think media, one of the thing is it has to be interesting stories. People have to read it. The media can say that, but when there's no story, media also cannot write it about. So I think it is linked both for me. But definitely there is a huge gap. Burma is between South Asia and Southeast Asia, and there is a huge gap between South Asia and Southeast Asia.
I think the gap was reflected in your travel schedule. You traveled more than 24 hours to get here, though the geographical proximity is much less. I'd like to open this up to the audience. Please be brief, ask questions, name yourself, and I will not be as kind as Kanak to allow you to ask very long questions. So, can start with the gentleman here.
This is Suryalal Amatya, a retired professor at the university. First of all, let me thank the 4 panel speakers. We all the time been focusing on the media survival in the environment, changing environment. But I'm going to put 2 questions in a different context. Context is the print media and the other media, particularly in Myanmar and Bangladesh. Talking to Myanmar, there has been democratization process has already started. Now the printed media and other media, to what extent it has been helping in changing the political environment congenial to the media? That's one question. The other one to Bangladesh is that, as you said in your presentation, 2 political parties are dominating, and that is reflected in the media also. How far, to what extent the media has been able to influence, change this 2-party domination in Bangladesh? These are just 2 specific questions. Thank you.
We'll take 2-3 questions and then ask the panelists to respond. The gentleman at the back, Lex, can you?
Lex Kessenberg, I'm working for CARE International in Nepal. I'm curious and interested actually with the panel about the general way you have been talking about the audience. I can imagine that if you talk about, for example, the rape cases that took place in India, that there is unanimous agreement about the horrific impact, or maybe Bollywood, or even journalists traveling around in Volkswagen Beetles, sharing their stories. But the moment you end up in politics, I have the feeling that people who read the newspapers or your articles are much more biased. I mean, they either want to read all the great things about George Bush or Obama, or they want to read the bad things about George Bush or Obama, because in a way, when you're reading newspapers, up to some extent, I think it is also trying to find a confirmation for your own opinion, or what you're already thinking. So how do you deal with that in an independent way? And lastly, related to international news, I see that in Nepal, I see that in my own country, in the Netherlands. I find it a bit of a concerning development that if you look at the international news, it doesn't really matter almost what newspaper you open up. The source seems to be the same and the reporting is exactly the same. So that's another thing, how independent are we in that regard?
Thank you. My name is Lena Hasle. I work in the Norwegian Embassy and I'm a global citizen. and I speak as the latter. I think this issue of engaging the reader or engaging them as a citizen is actually very interesting. And of course, you are also in a region where purchasing power is growing very rapidly. So it's in a way ironic that one can't get the money now that people are getting the purchasing power. Now, the fair trade, in some sectors, the fair trade model has worked. The fair trade journalist, how do we save the journalist who will do the serious work at the same time earn an honest living? Is there anything to learn, you think, from the fair trade movement? And not talking about media, because media, we think about power and rich people. But how can we appeal to the citizen to make sure the honest journalist can earn an honest wage? Thanks.
Namaste, my name is Sunita Nemafikana, and I'm an editor of Krishaka Pravedi. Actually, I used to do the specialized journalism. Here, my concern, I just want to grab this opportunity and get a feedback from your side. As Ameet sir said, that conversation with readers. As I am publishing my magazine, I am an editor from 2 years. I'm doing conversation with the farmers who are uneducated and who don't have money in their pocket. And that's time, even I started myself that I will not give a free content. You have to pay for content first. And second thing, you have to pay first, then you will get my revenue model. And third one, I just say that, okay, if you want a PDF file, again you have to pay. And what I did, I just message that, give me the 50 rupees recharge card PIN number, then I will send you my email, PDF email. And what I'm just taking that, in our context, South Asia, we don't have a paying mode. So that is my problem. Now my concern is that now I'm thinking to getting the investment. As I'm a newcomer and I don't have an investment, I'm a communication student. I'm trying to getting the investment from the business person who are related in agriculture sector. Is it will be affect my independency? Is it affect will my content? At your experience, anybody can answer. Thank you.
I think we'll just get the panelists first to respond, and if there is time, we will take more questions. But the panelists will be outside for our high tea. So those of you who don't get a chance, you can always corner them between their tea, and let them respond first.
Can I? Yeah. Just to answer or attempt to answer your question, sir. I'm afraid the bad news is I'm not sure how far we have some very fine journalists in the country and some good newspapers. I'm not sure how far they've been able to influence the two parties at all. What they can do and what they have done is basically analyze and inform the public regarding sometimes the absurdity of the stance taken by parties on various things, and also to to question the trajectory of where these political events are taking us, where this very destructive form of politics is taking us. And I'm not sure, one would hope that in a democracy, we should be able to see the results, of change through the ballot box. But the fact is that you need to have realistic, viable options for change. So we need to see those changes within the political parties. We have seen some movements, but I don't think that they are sufficient. There was one particular case of somebody who was running for election and was not given a party ticket because the system on which the party tickets are given are sometimes very questionable, but actually won as an independent. So there it was the public actually, and was later picked up by the party. So it was the public actually making a very clear statement about what we want from our politicians. And I think in that sense, all that the newspapers can do, and I think some of them are doing a good job of it, is to be brave enough to speak out about the absurdity and the destructiveness of some of this behavior. And in fact, in that context, I just want to mention one more thing, which I didn't have a chance to bring up earlier, which is that we have just had our draft national broadcasting policy. It's been approved by the government and it's been gazetted. And there is a lot of discussion going on in Bangladesh right now regarding concern over some of the provisions. So I don't want to take up time. I'll just give you one example of these provisions, which is to say that any reporting that will hamper friendly relationships with friendly countries is banned. Now, if you think about that, how is that even possible? Because just if we look very, very simply, what you're saying is then, can we not discuss the very contentious issues of water sharing, which are taking place with India? Because India is a friendly country, no, we can't talk about it, it might hamper relationships. Or if you look at we have this huge amount of revenue coming in from, remittances coming in from our migrant workers, particularly in the Gulf, many of whom, and in Southeast Asia, many of whom are facing very difficult circumstances. Now, we are very happy to take those remittances and say, they form X percentage of our foreign exchange revenue, but are we then not allowed to talk about the conditions under which these workers are kept, or the problems that they are facing, because those are friendly countries? So that's just one provision. There are many there. In fact, my editor has written a very interesting and very, I think, brave editorial on this regarding some of these provisions, which actually gives me hope for the future of journalism. But it does worry me in terms of targeting. I think, Ameet, when you were saying that the government will sit up and take a look, yes, the government may sit up and take a look, but I'm not quite sure what happens after they don't like what they see. So, so that's one thing. Lex, I think it was the point that you made regarding, I think it's not just in South Asia, I think it's anywhere in the world. People will choose a newspaper that conforms broadly to their political perspective. So when I was living in Britain for many years, The Independent is my paper of choice. It's still the paper that I read online, even though I'm not living there. So I think you have a general kind of profile of whether you want to call it conservative or progressive or liberal or free market, of the kind of paper. But I think the question is the extent to which, how far an ideological perspective is allowed to flavor the reporting. And it should not go beyond a certain point. You may have a general view that you want to read a paper that's liberal in its reporting, let's say, of immigration issues in Europe, but it can't, how extreme do you want that to get? Or you want one that's conservative on immigration issues in Europe. Does that mean that they think that the UK party UKIP is a good idea? So these are some of the point, I think, in terms of the papers we choose. Yes, we choose papers which broadly reflect some of our political views, I think, most of us. And in terms of the papers I can't speak for South Asia. I know in Bangladesh, yes, we do, you do see the Reuters, for example, BBC, Al Jazeera. These are many of the chosen news outlets from which the Bangladeshi papers will pick up some of their information. But I think, again, to be honest, that in itself tells you something. If they're choosing Al Jazeera versus a Gulf News provider, then I think that already tells you something about what that paper's general political stance is.
So could you respond to the question about how the print media may have been influencing issues in Burma?
For Burma, as you know, the information was controlled, the media was censored for many years, for more than 50 years. So what the private print media in the countries is doing, basically, I think mainly two things. One is the information that the people didn't get and the people could not get, and media could not get, that is there now. Information and news about the various stakeholders and sectors that are now there. So print media, why the government newspapers still give their version of the propaganda news, the print media is now providing the content and information that the people didn't get and could not get in the past. So that information is there. Secondly, in terms of the space, I think because of the transition, there is a democratic space, there is some spaces coming up. So that spaces the people are taking and using in terms of protest here and there, in terms of land grabbing and the people protesting it. So all these the print media is covering. For me, it is very, very important that the print media is covering the issues which are taking place in this transition, and that I think private print media is doing that good job. But what we are limited to, we are still limited to investigative reporting about, for example, military. We are still limited to sensitive issue that are linked with the previous military regime. Some of the reporters were jailed because they wrote a story about weapons factory. I have to admit that the report was not a good report, but still they should not be jailed for 10 years. So we had a big protest, and there was a big struggle. Now the government is coming down. So that democratic space, which is there now, small even though, is being used by the media so that the people are informed, and the people's rights to information is also there. Of course, we have a big limitation on the question of access to information. We don't get the replies from the ministries. We don't get the information from the military. Either they don't respond or they give propaganda facts or propaganda news. So that access to information is very much limited in the country. But for me and for many of the print media, private print media, we use the space which is there, which is coming up, and then to expand it. And so many of our reports and our newspapers are a lot to do with politics. In fact, Mizzima is known to be a political newspaper because we cover a lot of political news, such news, because that is linked with the transition, that is linked with the past and also present.
Siddharth, you want to take the question on is fair trade a model?
That's a very good analogy, actually. I've made a note of it to try to develop this as an argument. I think you're right. This is that's precisely what I have in mind, because just like the majority of coffee drinkers will be quite happy to pay less for rubbish Starbucks, but there will be people who have ethical concerns, and they'll always be global citizens, but they have they would be willing to step forward. And I think that's definitely a model that needs to be looked at. I wanted to also respond to the question asked by the young woman in pink, the agriculture question. I think that you see, any publication that's niche will attract advertising of a niche variety, right? So the Times Literary Supplement or the New York Review of Books, bulk of advertising is from publishers. Right, so that doesn't necessarily mean that there is any compromise of ethics or independence. But if the New York Review of Books were to tailor its reviews in order to suit the advertiser, that would be a problem. And given the kind of agricultural companies that we have in South Asia, chances are that you will pretty soon find them putting pressure on you. But I'm sure that you will have the capacity to withstand. So as long as you stick to your editorial principles, I don't see any problem with agricultural companies being advertising or even funding this. But you have to ensure the independence of what you're doing. Anybody who gives money, you will have to be clear to them that the decision for any editorial will rest with the editor and not with them.
And Ameet, the last curveball question of why do media assume the audience has a bias when it comes to politics? You are either with us or you're against us when you're reading us.
I'll come to that question too, but I also want to respond to Sunita's question. See, you are saying I have a magazine that is made for farmers, and farmers often don't have money to buy. What to do? I agree, maybe farmers are poor, but at the same time, I'm sure they are buying things that are important to them. So if your magazine is important, if it has value, they will buy it. It's not that farmers don't buy anything, they buy all the goods too. Second, I agree with Siddharth. There is no harm in taking advertisement from the agri-businesses. They will pressure you, someday they might ditch you, but you can ditch them too. Till then, have the money, right? And by then you will have developed more needs, and maybe you will have some more farmers who are paying for you. Just the question is, what is the limit you want to set for yourself? Whether you want to compromise, how much you want to compromise, and that is your decision. The agri-businesses cannot force you a decision. That will be independent, that will be yours. I agree with readers often reading newspapers or news content to confirm their egos, to confirm their views. But at the same time, they also read newspapers they don't agree with. It's not like they only read newspapers or only watch TV or only watch TV shows or listen to radio that confirms their views. They read, listen to, and watch alternative platforms they disagree with. And there you have an opportunity. You have an opportunity to influence them at the conscious and subconscious level. See, I often hear this complaint among the young reporters, even among the seasoned editors, why we are writing if no one is listening. You know, we had cases in Nepal in the last 6 months, like media was one in opposing Chief Justice leading the government, but he was appointed. Media was one in opposing the appointment of corrupt justices, and it happened. So often even the editor said, why should we write? No one is listening. Government is not listening. Parties are not listening. I agree media has limited influence on the discourse, but tell me if there is something else which has more influence in public discourse. There is none. And that is why we should keep on writing. That is why we should keep on speaking. That is why we should keep on speaking our mind and tell what needs to be told. Thank you.
On that very positive note, we are going to bring this very rich discussion to an end. I think one thing is confirmed, we probably need at least double the time to hear all the interesting viewpoints of speakers like this when we bring them all the way here. I'd like to ask the chairman of our South Asia Trust, Mr. Harish Sharma, to briefly summarize if these points can be summarized briefly. And while he's walking up here, I'd like to mention that the fair trade model of paying for quality, you can demonstrate your faith in that by going out of this room and buying the 2 excellent books as well as Himal magazines for what we think is a good fair trade price.
Thank you, Aunohita. First, let me congratulate my own team. Aunohita, with excellent arrangement to bring such a fantastic panel in Kathmandu. I was surprised to hear that the Myint traveled all the way from Yangon, and he just arrived this late morning and returning tonight at 11 p.m. flight. This shows the commitment. This shows the trust on Himal Southasian organizing capacity. And I'm very proud as a chair, and my board is very proud that the Aunohita and his team, her team, has definitely brought changes into Himal Southasian. In recent time, in the morning also, you heard there was a lot of tensions about our own organization, but slowly we are making up because we do a fantastic work. I'm proud of being part of the South Asia. I'm also belong to various initiatives, especially with the Alliance for Social Dialogue, where we have been thinking constantly over the years when Nepal was moving, or Nepal was having first round of Constituent Assembly elections and afterwards. A major concern looking around the South Asia was, yes, in terms of the the massification of democracy by virtual way, the internet, Arab revolutions, recent upsurge all over the world, real space for democracy is shrinking because the political organizations are being weak. My travel around the country in last 5 years, virtually nooks and corner, informs me that it is through the activism is alive. If we don't invest in the activism is mere talk. Similarly, when I listen for 4 hours, the various discussion here, it is through the journalist that the journalism is alive. We need dedicated people who can fight, stand, and protect its autonomy. I think that's why the discussion around, media is growing. Everybody is reading, access is very much there, economies are growing, but suddenly the free space within the media is shrinking. That was the discussion in the first session. The Paranjoy Thakurta, who has been very active and speaking, talking on this issue from India. We watch you, sir, in the televisions and various newspapers. The kind of corporatization that is going on, the kind of shift that is taking place in India is a great lesson for us. So, as Kanak said this morning, that the earlier notion was that what Bengal thinks today, rest of the India thinks tomorrow. Similarly, what is happening in India is definitely impacting all of us in South Asia. Therefore, it is very interesting to listen on Anuradha, Nilap, Pranjay, Subhranshu in the first half of the session, where Kanak fashioned it around the experiment around with India. Because I remember while growing as a young student, as a student activist in the early 80s, late 70s, we used to wait for hours for Times of India to arrive in Kathmandu in front of the Sandesh Griha. People Guru ko agadi pati. So I think we always look towards Dinman, Dharmayug. I grew up with reading Kadambini and various other literary magazines. Navaneet was there, and suddenly things have changed. Maybe the other generation that is coming is not so aware of the changes that are taking place. But as an optimist, I think changes are for good. Therefore, we may lament about it, things were not in the right track. Therefore, conversation like this is important. How to understand the changes that are coming and how to make best of the changes. Every society is constantly changing. Therefore, but worry is that who is steering that changes. The corporatization is a basically authoritarian model, whereas the people as an intelligent reader or people as an intelligent buyer, both require intelligence on the part of the people. Therefore, one of the major work of the activists is to keep alive the intelligence part of it. How do we inform through various discussion, and the expanding public space is important. The second part of the session that I listened to is that basically within the media, what are the challenges to survive in ever-changing? For example, there was discussion like, print media is declining, but suddenly we heard in the first panel that because of the language media, suddenly media is growing in India. So there are contradictory signals here. But the challenge is that once we moved into more what you call virtual arena of internet, social media, how to keep interest alive? Who would be the participant? I remember 2005 scenario in Nepal. Once King turned off every IP provider, we were in blank. Who controls the hardware in many of our countries? Therefore, I think the democratization of hardware is also important. Access to a small business, small technologies are also important, and we heard about it. And I think the Setopati experiment in Nepal is something that we would very happy and try to be part of it. For example, Ameet was saying that they're paying 50 rupees. Therefore, we need also an activist zeal. If something is alternative space is coming up, I think as an active citizen, we need to build on that. I think fair trade idea is very important. Although very small scale, we hear that the cooperative models and the fair trade models, which kept alive the onslaught of the capitalism in a various sphere. I think that's also a very important thing. I think overall, I enjoyed very much. So do the audience here. There were, some people were coming and going, but majority of you stayed on. And I would thank the audience here who participated with different questions. And I would like to thank Anuradha, Nilap, Pranjoy, Subhranshu, Ameet, Farah, Siddharth, Swayman for making your time to come to Kathmandu. The other way that Himal Southasian is very proud is that one can think from a small landlocked country about South Asia. This is what South Asian mean to us. We can be located anywhere, but think about South Asia as a community. I think community is important to fight the kind of onslaught, be it global capitalism or anything else, needs to be that sort of solidarity. With this word, I would like to invite, on behalf of the South Asian, for a high tea. Thank you very much.
1 second, also I have thanks to
Like Mr. Hariji said, many issues were discussed and diverse and rich views from all over South Asia were put forward, which made today's event very fruitful. And Himal Southasian team would like to extend our sincerest gratitude to the panelists. And for this, Himal Southasian would like to honor them with a total of appreciation. For this, I would like to invite Ms. Aunohita to hand over the Himal issues. And I would also like to invite the panelists of the first session to come up on the dais, please.